So Edward Laurence Kermode, born on the 1st of April 1915, and still a young man.
In heart.
Laurence, we've been talking a little bit about your early days, and I've been enjoying this, but it'd be nice to get it now down. Really, we're confusing the Isle of Man with Liverpool in your very earliest days when you were very young, aren't we?
Yes. I was born in the Isle of Man in Castletown in 62 Maloo Street, actually. It was a baker's, and my grandparents lived there, my maternal grandparents, my mother's grandfather and grandmother. And I knew that my earliest recollections of anything were in Liverpool, but I must have been 3 or 4 then, but I remember being in the very earliest days, but I've been thinking it over since. I wondered how I got to Liverpool, and I thought that I was taken there when I was a baby after I was born. But on reflection, I think that it's possible that my parents were already living in Liverpool at the beginning of the First World War, 1914, and that my mother had come home to her parents to have me.
Yes. So you'd be born Manx?
Yes, that I was born at her mother's house, in Castletown.
But you're telling me you remember things from when you were 3 or 4 then?
Well, it must have been. I can't. My very, very earliest recollections is being taken out into the street in Liverpool and to look up into the sky and to see a Zeppelin passing over. So that must have been during or towards the end of the First World War.
That's right.
I certainly remember also during the war, it must have been the end of the war, I also have vivid memories of a man who was demobbed, obviously, and he must have been a neighbour, friend or something. I don't know who he was, but he had his handcart with all his gear on out in the street outside of our house. And on that, amongst his gear, there was his rifle and his tin hat. And me, being a little boy, I wanted the gun, of course, naturally, you see. But I didn't get the gun, but he did give me the tin hat. And I had that tin hat for many, many years. As a matter of fact, eventually when we came back again to the Isle of Man, I was in a little bit of a gang. And the initiation ceremony, I laugh when I think about it, the initiation ceremony, you had to wear this damn tin hat and bang, the other one of the leader hit us on the head with it 3 times. But we had to bang on the head. I tell you, it was. But that was. He must have been friendly. But I remembered the tin hat and the guns and all that.
You were telling me that you remembered, or you didn't actually see it, but about a girl being tarred and feathered.
Oh well, yes. Well, on a Sunday afternoon, at that period of time, the whole of that area round about Queen's Drive, I think it is, Liverpool, was being rebuilt. It was just after the First World War, and we would go Sunday afternoons. We went for walks, and one of the favourite walks was out to Knowlesley Park, the big house there. And I remember us walking round the walls, and set into the walls were stocks where, the old stock where people were put in for misdemeanors and that sort of thing. But also, I remember seeing in this great big housing estate that was being built a certain telegraph pole or lamp post, I'm not sure which it was now, and the talk was that there had been a girl tied to this particular lamppost and she had been tarred and feathered. Now then, you asked me earlier, why would she be tarred and feathered? Well, of course, it was the Irish Troubles. A lot of people nowadays, they talk about the Troubles in Ireland, and which is at the very moment, of course, we know it's very much in the news. And a lot of people think that it's a comparatively new thing. Well, it's not at all, because it was back in the 20s, and it was in, what was it, 1921? It must have been 20, because I think it was either 20 or 21 when the Irish Free State was created. And we came back to the Isle of Man in 1921. I know that. I started school then. But this girl had been caught, so why she had been tarred and feathered, but that was one of the things that they did, you see, because either that she'd been colluding with somebody that she shouldn't have been, or whatever, I don't know. But I do remember that. It was one of those terrible things.
You've also retained a great deal of memorabilia of your lifetime, and you've got a lot of photographs and memories, and it's nice that you have. And one of them I noticed, I think you said was an uncle was he in the Canadian forces?
Yes. That was very interesting, that, because during all this time, there were people that were in our house that I didn't know, friends, obviously, of my parents. And my uncle Wilson had turned up, very smart looking. He was in the Canadian cavalry, dressed up very, very smartly. And one of the neighbours came in, or was in with us during, it must have been while this other man that I mentioned earlier with the handcart had been there, so it may have been at the time. But this lady was introduced to, this man was my mother's brother, and he was all the way over. He was with the Canadian Army for the First World War. And she said, well, isn't that strange? She said, I've just come up from the city, which was, the town in Liverpool, the city centre. And she said, I saw this handsome soldier and she said, I wondered who he was. She said, I was struck by his demeanour, because not only was he a smart-looking man, but he was also Canadian, you see, Canadian uniform. Yeah. And she said, here he is now. I never thought that he was your, relation of yours, talking to me mother.
What sort of memories do you have of your mother and father? Indeed, grandparents. Do you remember grandparents?
Oh, grandparents. Well, yes, I do remember my maternal grandparents. I do remember, but not my paternal grandparents, who were the most famous, or the one of them anyway was the most famous, but we talk about him. Yes, my mother's father and her mother, my grandfather was the baker for his son, actually. He'd been in business himself and he'd failed. I'm afraid he was too fond of the emulsion, the liquor, and he had failed because he'd had his own business in Port Erin at one time. And then his eldest son, one of his eldest and one of my mother's older brothers, was R.W. Holmes, and his son had 3 premises in Castletown. One was what we call the shop, where the fancy cakes were made, where he did those himself, Uncle Bob. There was a place midway down Maloo Street, which we call the Stores, and in there, the buns and the minced meat pies and all that sort of thing, they were made there, what they call the Smalls. And in 62 Maloo Street, where I was born, and my grandfather worked, that was where he made the bread. Yeah. So you see, they had Maloo Street, the bread, halfway down they had the buns, and then in the shop, behind the shop, there was another bakehouse where they made the cakes. And he also had, Uncle Bob, he also had a big cafe in Port Erin, which is now the Falcon's Nest.
Oh, yes.
Falcon's Nest, with that great big room there. That was a big restaurant he had there. He had all these things. But, that was Mother's side. But you see, when we were in, I would just, if I could refer back to Liverpool there, it was interesting because these are early memories, you see. My memories are of early days, really. Yeah. There used to be gospel meetings, like, what's the present day man comes over from America. There's a lot of them, but Dr. Billy Graham.
Billy Graham.
Well, there was a great thing in Liverpool, in England in those days. I suppose they were, well, I don't know what they were trying to do, but convert everybody. But I remember being in one of these and also going to taken to see a circus which was in another place. Now then, I don't know whether it was coming home from the circus or coming home from this gospel meeting, but at the circus I do remember the usual thing. I've seen it and heard of it since, but I do remember seeing it there, the big white horse telling the time by pawing the ground. You know, it's an old trick, you know, that I know of since I've been in the theatrical line myself. And but on the way home of either of those two events, the heavens opened. It was torrential rain. The streets were flooded, and it was all tramcar travel. And my cousin, Nellie Holmes, she was, who lived with us. She was the daughter of one of my mother's brothers, you see. My mother had two brothers living with us there in Liverpool during the war. Yeah. And this girl, she was an orphan, that's why she lived with us. She had a father, but he lived with us, but their mother had died with the flu epidemic or something like that. I don't know what it was, but she died. And she had a red coat. And all this torrential rain, the red coat died. The dye in the red coat died completely.
Dropped out of it.
It was all dropped. She was dripping red. Nellie was a redskin afterwards with the dye coming out of her coat. That was that coming home there from the. I told you about I went to school to St. John the Baptist School, which was only just at the top of the road.
Yeah.
And when although I'm a Manxman and born and more or less bred, you'll hear then when I said road that the Liverpudlian accent comes out. It's there because my first experiences of school for a couple of years must have been at Liverpool, in Liverpool. It was St. John the Baptist School.
Yeah.
And it was only just a few yards up. It was the end of our road. I remember there, I've shown you a photograph of great day. Thing in those days was Empire Day. We all dressed up. There was dancing around the maypole, and we all had red, white and blue, Union Jacks and all manner of things like that.
Well, I'm going to be looking out now for slight hints of Liverpool accent as we do the rest of this interview.
Well, I've got something about that, you see, about the Liverpool accent, which is rather ironic because having done that, and also because of my later experiences as a compere and Toastmaster, I haven't got the Manx accent, but it's ironic that one of my forte now, if anything, is performing Manx dialect poetry,
right.
Which is a laugh to me. I think about it, you know, but I work it. It's still there. It's at the back. But just that moment, I recognise, and people have said to me, you know, where are you from? Somebody said to me, the place where I get my hair cut the other day there, and this lady said to me, where do you come from? I said, well, I live up in Ballabruey, you know. I said, I didn't mean. I said, where were you? I said, I was born in the Isle of Man. I said, where do you think I come from then? Oh, I don't know. She said, I would have said that you were from some of the outskirts of Liverpool way. So, and it's just when I said that word, road, I realised why people recognise the Scouse accent.
Well, you did your early education in Liverpool, but of course you went to St. Thomas's School in Douglas as well.
I did indeed, yes. In fact, St. Thomas's School was the only school that's my education. I started when I came back to the Isle of Man, and apparently it was in 1921. I think I've got it somewhere written down. I did make a point of going to the school, and John Riley, the present headmaster there, brought out the register, and there it was. We were the three of us, my two sisters, elder sisters. I was the youngest. There was Rini, was my elder sister. She was born in Ballasalla. Edna, the middle sister, was born in Douglas, and I was born in Castletown, because they moved around a bit, my father and mother.
Yeah.
But anyway, we went to. I went to St Thomas's School. We all went to St Thomas's School, and recently I was invited to talk to the children there to tell them about what things were like in those days. Well, I got a bit of a surprise to find out. In my day, there was just the one big room. It was just right up to the rafters.
Yeah.
Well, now, of course, there are 2 floors there. Well, there weren't 2 floors. There was one, the big room was provided by one large, the heating, the only one heating was a big coke stove, which was in the middle of the room.
In the middle of the room, yeah.
In the middle of the room. The room was divided by a curtain.
Yeah.
There were 2 classes at the top end and 1 class at the bottom, the 2 classes at the bottom. And there was one little other room, which the infants, that's where I started in there, because I must have been, 21, I'd be 6 years of age, so was that 25? Yes, that's 15, 20, yeah. That's right, I'd be 6.
Yeah.
So it was in there was, and then you had standards 3 and 4, 2, 3 and 4. I said, well, I don't know, but the one teacher had it. Miss Stewardson, she was the teacher who took the other classes at the other side of the curtain, or when I was in it partly time too. Yeah. And the very first time, early days, when I was there, the first headmaster was a man that we used to call Joey Lease. His name was Mr. Lease, because we never, we always used to refer to him as the boss. It's a funny term to use, but it was the boss. We were talking, not the headmaster. He was the headmaster, of course, and Joey Lease. And I did say he must have been recently. I don't remember very much of him because he left short. Must have, a couple of years after I'd been there. Yeah. And there were 2 other headmasters while I was there, but. Joey Lease, I found out afterwards, we thought he was a bit of a tyrant, but he must have been a kindly man because he was Uncle Jack in the Isle of Man Examiner. He ran the children's club.
Oh,
yes,
did he?
yes.
Yeah.
And he lived up in Onken, and the house that he lived in is still up there. It's it just set back off the road, just past going towards the Manx Arms. It's set back off the road a little bit with palm trees growing in it. But that was Mr. Lease.
Yeah.
And we, as I mentioned, that there was only the one big coke stove. That was all the heating there was.
Yeah.
And we sat in long forms, 5 or 6 to a form.
In fact, just a seat. Did they have a back on all of that?
There was just the seat, and there'd be the desk was attached to the seat.
Oh, attached to it. Yes.
Yeah, but there were 5 or 6 you in the one.
Oh, right.
And the inkwell in,
Yes.
Within that. And I remember the great excitement when they had the new 2 to a seat forms,
yes,
which are with old hat now. Nowadays they sit round tables and all manner of things.
So you'd be 5 or 6 in a row when you were there then?
Oh, at first, yes, you were. The toilets were outside and they were in the open air. They're covered in now with a small extension that's been built over the infants' room.
Yes.
I was there from the age of. I left school when I was 14 because we did in those days, and there were many scholars there at St Thomas's School who became successful in their chosen careers. Fred Corty became the Island Fire Chief. He was one. Teddy Gill and Alf Crampton became master mariners, sailing vessels all over the world. Roy Cowley, when he left school, he joined the regular army, and then after that he was in the Palestine police force, which is no longer available. He was also a squadron leader. There were all sorts of people, have gone through St Thomas's. And the only education, you might say, really, was from up to 14 years of age. Yeah. Then you left school. And you could go to night school.
Yeah, it'd be basic education.
Oh, basic education, absolute basic, yes.
Reading, writing, arithmetic are the 3
That's
things.
That's right. And composition, and the teacher might draw an apple or something. That was the art lesson. That was the only art lesson you ever got. Yeah. And as for geometry and algebra and all.
Languages out the question.
And languages were literally foreign languages to us, double Dutch as far as we knew. We never had anything at all in that regard.
No.
We had, I learned far more after I'd learned school, because as I say, and another thing, you see, when I left school, I went to work. I took it upon myself, actually. There were two of us, were 14 years, coming up to 14, ready to leave school. Edwin Crellin, whom I knew later on in the musical world. Edwin and myself. Now, the then headmaster, his name was George Cannell, and he lived at the bottom of Summer Hill. Now then, in those days, the tram cars ran summer and winter.
Oh, right.
And he came in on George Cannell and another man who was a printer, whose name was Marshall Brideson, who was eventually to be one of the founders of Brideson Horrocks. Marshall Brideson came in with George Cannell every day on the horse car. And he said one day to George Cannell, "You got any likely lads, for an apprenticeship?" So he said, "Oh, I'll see." So he said to Edwin and myself, "Either of you interested?" Well, Edwin wasn't, because Edwin was more inclined to, he was more academic, I suppose, than me. I wanted to do something with my hands, you see.
Yeah.
And so he said, "Well, there's this job going with Louis Meyer as a printer." Louis G. Meyer, 19 Duke Street it was. So I went myself off my own, but I didn't go home to ask my parents or anything like that. I knew that I had I was coming up from leave school, you want to get a job.
Yeah.
So I went and I saw Mr. Meyer, and that was it. I was taken on.
Yeah.
Well, of course, in those days it was 5.5 day week. But what I was going to mention was we left school in short trousers, and I went to work in short trousers.
Really?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
And eventually, a pair of trousers. I think my mother, they were cut down. I wouldn't admit it, but there were a pair of my father's trousers cut down for me, because one of the fellas in the works with us, he used to call me tragedy trousers, And he said, "The old man's trousers." You went, "Laurence." I said, "No, they're not." Of course they were, but I wouldn't admit it. You see. And
Well, would you get paid as an apprentice? Because a lot.
Oh yes, it was a good 10 shillings a week.
Oh, right.
Which was very good, because printers were amongst the trades. They were very well paid.
Yeah.
Some apprentices in other trades only got 5 shillings a week.
And some actually had to pay to be apprentices. I think,
But
didn't they?
yes, but not in the trades.
No.
Some did, but I didn't know of any of them that had to do.
No.
And some of them, if you go further back, like when my father he was a baker as well, as all family were bakers, your mother's family. But my father, not only were an apprentice and maybe have to pay, I don't think you paid, but you slept on the premises too, as an apprentice. When he was a boy, he served his time in Castletown, and you slept in the bakehouse, or on the underneath or wherever, So, things have changed considerably. I think now, they take the children, they're taking them to see, and they get career advisors.
Absolutely,
what they should do for their career. What do you think you should do? And I see my mother come along, and they've got parents' evenings to come along and tell what they should do, what they think they're suitable for. It was a job, and we went for it, and that you were lucky.
Yeah.
The idea was you went for a trade. You were very lucky if you got a trade.
Right. So when you got home and told your parents you got the job,
yes, I said, "I'm starting."
They'd be delighted with it.
And yes, and I said, "I need a black apron." So they said to tell your mother to get an apron. So over the weekend, she had to make a black apron. It would be black stuff. I don't know what they used to use for blackouts and that sort of thing, but it was a black apron.
Yeah.
And she made the apron for me, and then I started down in the cellar.
And what were you doing first of all?
I was an apprentice.
Yeah.
Apprentice printer.
What did that mean in those days? I mean,
learning the trade of printing. But I mean,
getting to use all the
type. Well, I started off in down below. Oh, I mentioned Marshall Bridson travelling. Well, it was him he was the machine room foreman in Louis Myers, you see.
Ah, right.
So I was there. Now, if you go down, it's a hairdresser's now at the end of King Street on the corner of, there's a, the front of the shop is now animal feedstuffs, and not animals, pet stuff.
Yes, yeah.
But at the back side of it, where we used to go into work, there is ladies' hairdressers. But if you look down on the level with the pavement, you'll see an room down there.
A cellar,
well, that's where we started. You wouldn't be allowed to work there now, but we worked in the cellar. And one of the most interesting things is this. When I first started to work there, one of my jobs, the very first job, was to stand behind a great big machine to guide the sheets of printed matter that were coming off.
Right.
And there were great big sheets, and it was a book, and the book that was being printed was the second edition, or the second running, of Sophia Morrison's Manx Fairy Tales.
Oh, really?
And the cover was an octavo sheet. Now, the cover was a linen piece, and that was printed on a machine, and that with colourless ink, and then he put them to one side, and then they had to be dusted with gold dust.
Oh,
it was what we call bronzing powder.
Yeah.
There was silver, which we used for wedding cards, and there was bronze. I don't know what you use that for, and the gold.
Yes.
Not very often. It wasn't real gold, I suppose, but anyway, it was very. That's another thing you wouldn't be allowed to do, because I was stood there with these sheets, with these covers of the book coming off the machine in this colourless ink, and I had to dip a piece of cotton wool into this thing, which you get up your nose and all sorts of things, and dust them, and it stuck to the thing. You see, then you had to dust them off afterwards with another piece, a clean piece, and then of course they were sent up to the bookbinders, and they were part of the cover that formed the thing. It has since been reproduced in in the modern format of. They're selling them up in the museum.
But that's a great piece of Manx history, being
yeah,
there
yes,
to publish it.
I was there watching the big sheets come off, and then I was also involved with as an apprentice, just standing there. And but you see, Louis G. Meyer, unfortunately, he went bankrupt after I'd been there 2.5 years, I think. 14, yes, that's right. Now then, this is the foundation of Bridson and Horrocks started there, because there was Marshall Bridson as the machine room foreman. Harry Horrocks was a senior apprentice who was 19 when they folded up. I was the junior apprentice. I'd be 16.5 by that time, 2.5 years from 14, you see. Well, of course, I didn't have any money or anything like that, but Horrocks and Marshall Bridson, Mr. Bridson, of course, he was to me, and Harry Horrocks, they started up in Market Street.
Yes.
And I had no work. I was out of work. I nearly went to work for Sam Norris, but he was seeing me, and there was some business about the unions, whether I was whether there was the quota. There was a quota in those days. Only so many apprentices to tradesmen, you see, and there must have been some hold up. But I do remember that I was down in Noble's Baths on a Friday afternoon. We always used to go on a Friday from school, you see, and I'd kept it up afterwards. And I was down there swimming in there, and I remember Harry Horrocks came in because they told him that he'd been looking for me because they wanted to see if I was coming. He said, "What are you going to do, Laurence?" I was in the water, and he's talking to me, leaning down. He said, "What are you going to do, Laurence? Are you coming with us, or are you going with Sammy Norris?" I said, "I'll come with you." Because I said, "I'm being messed about." I said, "When do I start?" He said, "Tomorrow." Well, it was Saturday. Well, of course, in those days you worked 5.5 days a week.
Yes.
And that was in 1931, you see. So that was the beginning of Brides and Horrocks.
And you stayed with Brides and Horrocks as a printer,
As a printer.
virtually through your whole career?
No,
did you?
no. Half of my
Ah,
I've been in printing all my life.
yes, I thought you had.
But 26 years I did with with Brides and Horrocks or so, and I did another 26 with the Examiner and Times, or the
Oh,
Times and
yes.
Examiner.
Yes.
And Hopper Collister. I worked with the Nelson Press for a while too, with Hopper when I left Brides and Horrocks.
Well, did printing change very much as you...
It hadn't changed since Caxton's day.
No.
No, it hadn't until the linotype came into being. Now, and then that was the biggest change.
Now, what was linotype? What was that?
A linotype is a machine with a keyboard on it
yeah.
that the printer sat down, he tapped the thing, there was and little matrices formed up. There were little brass matrices
Yes.
which formed up in a line. They came down a chute from the back.
Ah.
They were all up at the back of this big machine. You'll see
Yes.
one down in Peel Road where they are now. They don't use them now,
No,
of course.
no.
But all these little mats, they used to call matrices, they were brass matrices, they came down. And there were different, like, you know, a key design,
Yes.
where they're all different letters had a different key design, because when they went up they would fall down into their different boxes,
Yeah,
you see.
right.
All the letters of the alphabet and the
Yes.
figures. So when the operator tapped a key, one of these things, mats would come down and form up in a little piece, a holder in front of them, and then he would stop it and he'd look at it to see, he could read the letters
Yes.
and read what it said. He had a handle there, he lifted it up, and that
Went into position.
went away into the it was a big molten lead type
Yeah.
molten metal,
Right.
and that was forced into these things, which formed what we used to call a slug.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, they were. We never talk about them garden slugs. There was a slug of metal. Type high. That's another thing. Type high was the same height as a shilling in the
Yes.
old. If you put it on end, that was type high. That's a pound coin.
Yeah.
But it was type high was that certain height. You see, it
Yes.
had to be. And that was when you had a linotype. But previously to that, if that was before the linotype, after the linotype was invented, well, before that, and what I did was taught, right through, was hand set.
Yeah,
Everything
yes.
was hand
Hand
set,
set, yeah.
in what you call a setting stick, and you picked the letters out of the case,
Yeah.
and there was upper and lower case.
So when linotype came along, then it was a revolution almost, was it?
Well, it was. The linotypes have been in for some considerable time, but I mean, in my younger days, they'd only been invented maybe 100 years before, which wasn't. It's only a flick of the eyelid, because hand setting, printing hadn't altered since. What's his name? Caxton and Winkendy Word and all these other guys, you know.
So what was the difference? I mean, after you'd done the linotype setting.
Well, the linotype was. Did I mention that? It was hand done. I told you all about the matrices and then come down. But hand setting, you had to pick every letter out of what we called a case, which was put up on the stand. And there was the one that was in front of you. Was the lower case, which are all the small letters, and up above that was all the capital letters.
Yeah.
And you had to pick out every letter of every word singly.
That's right.
Put it into a setting stick.
But didn't you have to put it back to front as well?
Well, it is back and front, but you can read it. But actually, it's upside down.
Upside down, was it?
Yes, but it was upside down, but it wasn't like that upside down. It was like.
As in a mirror?
As in a mirror,
Yeah.
yes. So we could read that just the same as anybody could read ordinary, straightforward.
Yeah.
It didn't, I don't know why, but it came naturally to you.
But then you'd have to put all those letters back to where they came
all
from.
those letters, after it had been printed, it had to be what we call dist, which was an abbreviation of the word distribution. All the type had to be distributed back into the cases,
into its proper
because
letters,
they all had to be used again.
Yeah.
Now those letters were a lot stronger type than the linotype, because the linotype the metal was a softer metal. Now when the linotype, which produced these slugs of metal, they were all stuck together, you see, the linotype slugs. They were all, the letters were all in one row and stuck together with the line. Now afterwards they were just tossed aside, dumped into another big melting pot, not on the machine, not on the linotype. They were melted separately into big ingots, you see, in another melting thing.
So it speeded up the job then?
Oh yes, yeah, oh considerably. Linotype, you see, if you talk about going back to the days of Nelson, you know, and the old times, if you look at those, all those newspapers are all hand set.
Well, our local papers were hand set when you were working there at the Examiner.
Well, not the Times and Examiner. No. Some of the and even the Mona's Herald had a linotype because they were one of the oldest ones. But if you go over to the Peel City Guardian, that was hand set.
Yes.
Oh yes, and some of the stuff was hand set. You might get all the headings of when I was working in the Times and Examiner, the headings of stories were all hand set.
Yeah, yeah.
See, or the big type.
The main types. Yeah,
the big lines were hand set. So.
But people today would laugh when you talk about linotype because it's moved on immensely now to computerisation, hasn't it?
Computerised, even since I left. When I finished in the printing, physically printing, they had introduced offset printing, offset. But even then, it was a different system to what it is now.
Yes.
In those days, we still had. They had keyboards, but what they were doing, what they produced on the keyboard was a punched tape, and that tape had to go into another machine which produced the printed word. But nowadays they used the keyboard straight into their, what do they call it, VDU, visual display unit.
Right.
And what they type then is then produced immediately. And not only can that, by the press of a button, they can alter a word from here to there.
Absolutely.
They can put borders round. They can put lines here. Wonderful. I mean, we had to do all this by hand. Even with linotype, you had to put rules around borders and a job to get them mitered and all that sort of thing. Oh, it was all. And let me tell you, it was 7 years apprenticeship I had to serve before I was a journeyman printer. And the word journeyman printer is interesting, which people will not know today. But the reason was, in any trade where you were a journeyman, it was because when you'd finished your set time, whether it was 5 or 7 or whatever years, you then journeyed. You were kicked out of where you worked. You didn't, don't you, there? You journeyed then from place to place, town to town. Seeking work, of course. So
were you kicked out or not?
No, I wasn't kicked out. No, I was kicked out of Louis G. Myers halfway through, wasn't I?
That's right.
Yeah,
that one kicking out was enough, really.
Well, yeah. I left the others.
While you were doing this, then presumably you got into the artistic side of life and into painting, which we'll talk about, and particularly into singing, didn't you?
Yeah, yes. I got into singing because, for good or evil, I was a natural. I had a natural voice. I often say to people, if there's anything that I've got, any talent at all, it's in my voice. And yes, I knew that times were changing. You see, I'd always been interested in singing. You know, dance bands. I've sung in the what you call the Pallidi dance, and I've sung in all sorts of things like that, you know. But I realised that when I was being asked to sing at functions and in like in Masonic meetings and things like that, I needed to have a bit of a repertoire, you see, of straight stuff. You couldn't get up and sing the usual
the sort of pop
stuff. No, you had to have something. So I said to Harry Pickard, I was friendly with Harry, and I said, could you give me a few lessons, Harry? He said, aye. He said, yes, certainly. He said, I'll help you, you'll help me. So at that time he was the choir master of St Ninian's Church.
Oh, yeah.
So he said, will you come and sing? Well, I'd been brought up a Methodist, but I was married in the church I was married in the old All Saints Church, and don't you say tin tab. My wife would turn in her grave, and she was belonged to there, and she hated people saying the tin tab.
Yeah.
It was All Saints Church to her. Anyway, so I said, okay. I said, but I don't know the church. So he said, you soon learn it. So he gave me lessons, and I went to sing, and I was in the church choir there. And he said, well, do you want to go in for this properly, enter the guild and that sort of thing? I said, yes, why not? So he said, okay. So he put me in for the open tenor. I was a tenor, you see, open tenor class. And the first time I was in, I won the first time, yes,
yeah.
First prize, yes.
Really?
Now, it was very, very flattering, really. But at the same time, it wasn't, because I was immediately catapulted into what we call the special class. I am now what you might call a special tenor, amongst the special tenor class, you see. And because of that, I was then, where with the open tenor, you just had to sing one song, but with the special, you had to sing two, and you were in they were a lot harder songs you sang. Although the song that I won with, the open tenor solo, has since been used in the special class. It was Our Moon of My Delight, which was based on Omar Khayyam. Our Moon of My Delight that knows no wane. It was it's a beautiful song, but it was a difficult song to sing. But I was lucky. And as I say, I won. That's all there's to it.
Yeah. So did you keep on entering?
And then, yes, I often say to people, I start at the top and work my way to the bottom. Because the best I ever did in the special tenor was to tie for second place.
Yeah.
But I did, and that was, I forget. Oh, it was, yes, it was singing Aida. It was that's a beautiful thing. It's right at the beginning of the opera, Aida.
What titles did you enjoy singing? What songs did you like most that you sort of permanently put in your repertoire?
Well, in those days, of course, I used to sing, and I sang what were the usual middle-of-the-road stuff. But if you're talking to me about what my musical tastes are, I have very Catholic tastes, actually. And I've said this previously, because I like the top of the sandwich and the bottom, but I don't care for the middle bit. I'm not too fussy about the... what do they call them? Musical comedy, the choral union type of stuff. That kind of thing. I'm not too keen on that. I like the grand operas and the beautiful arias. I like that, and I like the bottom. And I love.
Give me the bus fare to Laxey, for instance.
Well, that's a different sphere on its own. I enjoyed that when I was singing, but I realise, of course, it's all very shallow stuff, really, but very, very enjoyable. And a lot of people must have given a lot of enjoyment to a lot of people because there's still people asking for give me the bus fare to Laxey and all this carry on, all the. The Laxey girls or the boys, and oh gosh, I don't know, all these Stuart Slack songs we sang, but we sang all that.
But before you sang, didn't you play an instrument? I seem to remember you played a banjo.
That's another phase. Yes, that was earlier. I'd only be 18 then, around about 18. Yeah. Now, I mentioned earlier Edwin Crellin, who was in school with me. Well, we were obviously the same age. Now, I was friendly with Edwin and Bobby Kelly and Freddie Ogley. We were all in the 1st Douglas Scouts. But by this time at 18, Bobby was a wonderful pianist, Bobby Kelly. Yeah. And Edwin was, as I said before, he was the intellectual type. He sent away for a saxophone, and he'd learned it before it came, he knew how to play it. Well, he'd learned it by reading the book. Yes, he was one of those type. Yeah. I couldn't do it. And Freddie was a hard man. He was the drummer, you see. Yeah. And I was learning the banjo. Now, I was going to lessons, and I remember I used to go to a man up in Oncon. He was an old fellow, he was, but I was already in the band. You see, I was starting the cart before the horse, because I was a singer. That was why I was in with this
yes.
guy. I was the singer. I actually sang, and people may laugh about this, but it actually did happen before the days of microphones and radio and all that sort of thing.
Didn't have a megaphone, did you?
I sang through a megaphone, and I've got the photograph to prove it. I'll show it to you later on. It was there because I've got a photograph. We were the Knights of Rhythm. Bobby Kelly, piano, Edwin Crellin, saxophone, Freddie Ogley on the drums, and Laurence Kermode was the singer holding the banjo. But the banjo, as a matter of fact, what my career with the Knights of Rhythm came to an end by virtue of the fact that the banjo didn't belong to me, it belonged to my uncle.
Yeah.
He had it, he'd never played it or whatever, but he lent it to me. That's when I started learning lessons. And then he must have fallen on hard times because he wanted the banjo back. and so, of course, that was the end of my career as a banjo player. I did later on, of course, when I appeared, when we talked about it, I played the guitar a little bit. I came to, as a matter of fact, the very first guitar I ever bought, I only bought two as a matter of fact, but the first one, I brought it to you and asked your opinion of it.
And what did I say?
Yes, well, you were very diplomatic about it. You said it wasn't too bad, it was all right. I think I paid £16 for it or something. Oh, before that I'd bought one. Long years before that, I think.
Yeah.
And then I sold that. I don't know what happened. I never went any further with it. I just had ideas of playing the guitar.
But didn't you play flute and
oh,
mouth
yes,
organ?
but, oh, yes. Well, I got mixed up with Mike Williams, you see, with the Mike, Laurie and Al story. How I come to be involved with Mike was... it was in the end of the 60s, 69, 70s, the folk revival had started. And the Mannin folk, who were in those days were known as the Travelling People, but they had to change their name because of somebody else was Travelling People and they objected to them in England. Anyway, I used to go there down with my wife and sometimes on my own down to the lodge, Glen Helen.
Oh, yeah.
Glen Helen they were playing.
Yeah, that's right.
They were the residents in there, and a certain night they used to play there regularly, and I used to go down and listen to them. And there was a young fella used to get up, they would do a set, and during their interval there was a young fella get up and play a guitar, and he'd do half a dozen songs maybe and come off. And whilst I was there and they were playing, and I remember, and I was singing my guts out, you know, joining in at the chorus, and I was known there, and be in the front row, and they were saying, Laurie is doing this and all that. And I remembered that I could play the mouth organ when I was a boy.
Oh.
So I bought a mouth organ, one of these blues harp mouth organs, a vamper they call them, and I was joining in when they were playing. I said, "What key you're in? You know, tell me. You know what I'm playing. Whenever you're in G, you know, I'll play. You know, I'll join in with you."
Yeah.
And then I used to do this quite often, you see. And this young fella, Mike Williams, I found out his name was. I met him during one time, talking to him in the passageway or something, in that place where you all meet, and he said, "Would you like to come along with me?" He said, I'm playing somewhere. Anyway, I got attached to him somehow.
Yeah.
And then the very first time that when he said, "I'm playing so I used to follow him round really, and he was playing in the cellars of the original place up on
Fort Anne.
Fort Anne, yes, in the cellars there. And on Wednesday night I used to go there. He was playing, and I used to follow him and play there with him. But he said to me then, he was getting paid, but I wasn't involved with that at all. I was just following him around. And we also used to go to a place in Laxey.
You were playing a bit on the
mouth
they used to call it the harp in folk circles.
Oh, well,
the mouth harp, wasn't it?
Yes, it's the harp. It is a mouth harp, or the gob harp, some people call it. But it's a harp, they call it. Yes, it is the harp. I used to always call it the harp. And but it's the mouth harp. So eventually, somehow, I got involved with Mike, and as I say, he was playing up at the Fort Anne, and he was also playing at Laxey, and he said to me one time, would you like to play, he was in theatricals himself doing a little bit, Service Players I think, one of those groups, and he had a part in this play, and in the interval he was oddly enough, he was a Yankee sergeant in this with an American accent, with a Manx accent, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
A GI, and in the interval, he was performing. So he said, "Would you like to come with me?" I said, "Aye, all right." So that was my very first public performance, really, and the very first thing we did was Dirty Old Town.
Oh yeah.
And we also sang and did Laxey Wheel, I suppose, and maybe, I don't know, it was only a couple, maybe it was only the two, I'm not sure. It wasn't very much, but we certainly did that. My first performance was when I was 7 years of age in the Villa Marina. I don't know if it was the Villa Marina or the Palace, because it was outside, and they both had bandstands outside.
Right.
And I don't know which it was, but must have been about 7, because we were here, I was home, and I was going to Victoria Street Methodist Sunday School, and it was one of the classes was called the action songs, you see, and we were singing. Now there were only 2 boys in this action song, and the rest of them were all girls. And of course I was, as you know, being an extrovert, I was the leading hand. I was the front singer.
Yes.
And for some reason or another, I was dressed up in a coster's outfit.
Yeah.
I know my parents and aunts and all had to scour the town for all these pearly buttons to sew onto this little costume.
Yes.
I was a coster. I don't know why. And I also had a little wheelbarrow that I was
Yeah.
pushing. And we won. We won I don't know whether we won or not. I think we did, actually, because we were taken afterwards to some. But it was one of the Sunday school teachers with all the children in Sunday school, and the boy in it was a fellow called Brideson, and Ron Brideson, he was born in Gellings Foundry on the South Quay there. His father was the foreman, the manager.
Oh yeah, right.
His father.
Yeah.
Ron has died since, sadly enough. But we were there, and that was my very first stage appearance, you see. And then afterwards, I have another photograph of my final when I was 80. Not my final, because I've been performing since.
Yes.
But on my 80th birthday, which was a marvellous affair. But I sang with Mike then, and then the manager of the Fort Anne was an Irish fella, and he was very interested in folk music. And there was another group of people, I didn't know them then, but this manager was getting transferred from the Fort Anne to the Castle Mona.
Yeah.
And I'd met this group once out at I mentioned Mike was playing out at Laxey. Well, he said, there's a room outside. We used to play in the bar down below with our backside up against the fireplace to half a dozen people that were in the bar, that's all.
Yeah.
Mike said, well, there's this other group on. I'd never met them before. But it was Triad.
Oh, yes.
And they played, Mike and I did the traditional stuff,
Yeah.
or acoustic, I should
Yeah.
say. They were electric and acoustic. And we played with them that night. Well, we didn't play with them, but we did. I was joined in with Mike. We did. I must have by this time had a bit of a repertoire with Mike. You see, well, I had a repartee with Mike as well as
right.
repertoire.
Yeah.
Difference, but the two things that we both enjoyed. And so he said this lot. He said they're quite good, really. Anyway, the next thing was this manager who's got the transfer to Castlemona said, well, we go down there. So I still wasn't getting paid. And now Mike was hired, Mike Williams, and Triad. There were two. Well, I went down with Mike. Well, I was a couple of nights there with Mike and Triad. You see, they would do a set, then Mike and I would go on and do a set. And so that's how we split the night. So after a couple of nights, one of these chaps in Triad said, I think you deserve paying, Larry. He said, you're not getting paid. I said, no. Well, he said, why not? So the next thing, Friday night, we were playing 2 nights, Friday and Saturday, I got £2 on Friday. I thought, oh, this is great, you know, £2. I'm talking about 1970.
Yes.
71.
Yes.
1970 it was, 71. So I thought, it's great, this. And then I appeared on Saturday, and I got another £2, you know. I thought, oh, it's fine. And then it went on from there.
Yeah.
Well, we were in the Castle Mona playing for 3.5 years.
Right.
2 nights in the winter, Friday and Saturday. In the summer, we played Thursday, Friday and Saturday.
Yeah.
Not only that, I was only with Mike then. There was just Mike and Laurie then. That was our act. I was with Mike for 7 or 8 years, I think, before Al joined us.
Yes, that's Al Laurence. of
Al
course.
Laurence joined us, yes. Well, we, apart from singing in the Castle Mona, Mike and I, we were also the resident singers in the Falcon Cliff Hotel for the folk club that was up there.
Before we move off your showbiz career, I want to talk to you about something else. And I wasn't aware of these, but I am now that you've shown me the programmes for them. 2 shows, one called Raise the Roof and the other called Raise a Cheer.
Yes.
Now, what were these all about?
Well, this was, I did a long man and boy, you might say, from the Boy Scout movement. I was in as a boy from 11 right up to when I was married, actually, eventually, you know. And we put the roof had blown off the Scout Hall, had been damaged in a stormy night. And Mr. Fisher, the Scoutmaster, whom we all called T.O., everybody called him T.O. He was known as T.O., not to his face, of course,
No.
but he was T.O. And he had this idea of, because the Scouts, the first Douglas Scouts, had put on a big show once before my time, actually. It must have been after the First World War. Oh, talking about that, I was also in another show in St Andrews before this. I did a show in St Andrews Hall. This was when I was in my late teens, these.
Yes.
But before that, when I was 12 or 13 or 14, I was in a show called Of One Blood.
Oh.
I've got the script somewhere still, and it was about after the First World War, about 2 scouts who meet. Their parents. One was a German boy, and one was I was a British scout, and whose father had been in the army. And the other was the German boy whose father, and one of them had been shot, or they'd met, or something like that. That was what it was saying.
Right.
And
This was serious drama, really, was
it
it?
was
Yeah.
serious. And I remember that the one thing about it, that a line it said that says, it's a biblical quotation, really, I think, because it said, "He shall make of one blood all the nations of the earth, and peace will reign," you know, that sort of thing. But in somewhere, I looked it up one time, I found it, a report of this written by Bert Stevens, you know, Bert,
Yeah.
remember Bert Stevens? Well, Bert knew about this, and a report of this in one of the local newspapers. It would be the Mona's Herald, and he went through the cast, blah, blah, blah. And this is the bit I wanted to, when I said before about my voice, if there's anything that I've got, he said the part of so-and-so was played by Laurence Kermode, whose clear diction it was good to hear. No. So my speaking voice, you see.
Yeah. So Raise the Roof and Raise a Cheer were Harriet Morehouse productions, were they?
Yes, yes. I don't know how it started off with Harriet, but the idea for this Raise the Roof, which was the first one, was in 1951. And there
That
had
was to
been,
put a new roof on.
I was going to say that there was a stormy night, and the roof had been damaged, blown. One end had been blown off, I think. Yeah. So we needed to raise money to a new roof. Of course, by this time I had been in the Scouts some considerable time. I joined when I was a boy of 11. That's when you couldn't join before, but. The Boy Scout movement was a tremendous thing. I always say one of the greatest influences of my life has been the Boy Scout movement. I know it's changed considerably now, and probably in all probability they do enjoy it as much as we did in our day, but it's a different thing altogether.
Yeah.
But it was a wonderful thing. So much so that I had occasion I was brought up in Hillside Avenue, which is quite close to Domain Road where the Scout Hall still is.
Yeah.
And my mother said to me one night, "Where are you going tonight?" I said, "I'm going up to the hall." She said, "You're always going up to the hall." She said, "You're like a man going out to the pub." Yeah. Well, it was true, because we always had something to do.
Yes.
We were always working or meetings or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And I was very active in the Scouts and enjoyed it. Wonderful times that we had. But this was raised. But when I see look at this program here of Raise the Roof, the various things it was all sorts of things that were, it must have gone on for hours. But I was involved with it in many things. I didn't realise. When I look at it, there's down here the Hillbury Billy Boys.
The Hillbury Billy Boys.
Hillbury Billy Boys.
Tell me about that.
Well, that was that was part of Harriet Morehouse. Harriet Hart, she was originally. Harriet Morehouse. That was part of hers. I lived in Onken at the time, and there was to be a concert was going on. Jack Niverson was the compere, and he was behind it. It was for some charitable effort, and Harriet had this idea of a group of men, singers, you see, and she'd asked various people in the village and I was involved with Londu Choir, and she asked me, and it finished up. It started off. We had musicians with it as well in it, you know, joined in. What was his name now? Athol Moore.
Athol Moore.
He played the guitar. Johnny Ventro played the fiddle. That's the fellow that used to be on the... and Paul Farragher, Phil Farragher, his name was guitar. Crawford played the accordion. Dwyer played the bass. He was left over from the Marine School of Music. Tommy G, drums, vocalist. P. Corlett, D. Gellings, Stan Cowan and Peter Cowan, Corlett, Gelling, McEwen, E.L. Kermode, that's me, F. McMullen and Cyril Kane.
So you were all the Hillbury Billy Boys.
Well, that was, you see, we didn't know what we were going to be called, but it evolved into a country and western group, you see, because
a hillbilly group, I guess.
Hillbilly group, it was, yes.
What sort of things did you sing?
Oh, we sang...
Ghost Riders
in the Sky, yes. And I was the front man, of course, and they were all singing on either side of me. Yeah. Photographs of that somewhere, of me in the front. And we were all dressed up in cowboy outfits, you see.
Yes.
The chaps on us, you know, made out of cardboard or paper, some cowboy hats on us, the heads. Oh, we were doing all the stuff, you see, and we sang cowboy songs, and we sang other songs that weren't cowboy songs as well, I suppose. But that must have been how we gravitated towards this, to be involved in Race Roof. But when I see, you look at the bill here that was in this one show, the Manx Gymnastic Club, Jack Dugdale, Moods and Music, singer Mary Radcliffe, duet Mary Corkle. Oh, Howard Rudd, he was a comedian in his own right, you know.
Well, then when you went on to Raise a Cheer, you've got you've got Howard Hampton there. I think Mary Radcliffe
of course,
again.
Howard was in the other lot too, because he was another man that was in the Scouts with us. You see, a group of us, all in the Scouts.
Dan Miney and Eileen Peters were in Raise a Cheer.
Well, raised, yes, and it was good stuff. And the pianist, holding it all together, of course, was George Broad, LRAM.
And both were at the Gaiety, were they?
Both were at the Gaiety Theatre.
Yeah.
And wonderful reception we had to both of them, because we got all the Scouts' parents and uncles and grandparents. Yeah. But they were good shows, and they went down very well indeed. And Harriet, she had very good ideas, you know, of grouping all this together.
So you went then from this cowboy uniform into a Toastmasters get-up, didn't you? Now, how did that all happen, the Toastmaster?
Well, it all started, I was still doing bits of compare jobs and that sort of thing. And the first Toastmaster proper in the Isle of Man had been a man who was employed by a man called Perry, the manager of the Villa Marina.
Mm.
And he was friendly. I think he used to drink with this man who had been a Toastmaster in England, who was a Manx fella
Yeah.
that I knew because I sang with him. He was a wonderful bass voice, Phil Corlett.
Mm.
Now, Phil was a chorister in Liverpool Cathedral.
Yeah.
He worked as well, but he was a chorister.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful, wonderful bass voice singer. And I used to sing duets with him at these various functions, you see. I mean, if we got a quid or 2 quid, we were lucky, you know. And Perry knew Phil lived in Castlemore Avenue, had a boarding house there, and he used to drink with him in the Central, the pub there. And he needed a Toastmaster, Perry, he said. So he said to Phil, he said, he'd been on the circuit in Liverpool, the Masonic circuit, singing, round about. He employed by Rushworth and Dreeper. They used to employ these. As a matter of fact, one of them that was on the same circuit was that fella who's the comedian, the Liverpool, particularly...
Oh, Ken Dodd.
Ken Dodd.
What?
He was on the circuit singing
Yeah.
at the time that Phil was.
Yes.
And he said that the reason why he became a comedian, because we used to laugh at him because he had such a funny face. He used to pull such funny faces, his teeth with that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so they got Phil. He said, I've seen them. Phil said, I know, what then? What do you want me to do? Just make a few announcements, you see. And it was for the corporation, for these dance things, and they had, they used to have these people coming over, conferences, you see, and they needed something to do this. So he did it, and as a matter of fact, the red coat belonged to the corporation. They used to keep, hang it up.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, after he went back to Liverpool, or he retired. I think he went back to Liverpool. Not sure now. But anyway, Phil retired from it, and Dan Miney took over the job. They gave it to him because Dan, of course, had been ringmaster down in the circus down where the present bus station is. There was a circus there once upon a time.
He'd been ringmaster there?
Yes, he was a ringmaster there. And they asked Dan, you see, well, Dan was also another man of parts. He was a plasterer by trade, all the Mineys were. And wonderful singers and voices, you see. But he was also a coach driver at this time, and he couldn't do a performance for the Villa, you see, one occasion. And it was the civil servants, English, the local government, LGB, I think they were, but they were having a big conference over here. And he couldn't do it, and they asked me. I don't know if it was him that approached me or the Villa knew me. And said, you just make these announcements. You had, people coming down and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Just go. So I went the night before to see Dan, what he was doing, and making these announcements. I thought, well, I can do that. I'm used to making announcements. So that was, the red coat was hanging up in the in the props room there, the Villa Marina, in the
So there was no formal training
No, not at all. No, you just played it by ear, you see. And I knew, and of course, well then, oddly enough, these people said to me, look, we said, Mr. Kermode, we've got a lunch here on so-and-so, can you do that? I said, well, or maybe an evening job, whatever it was. I said, oh yes, but I said, what about Mr. Miney? I said, never mind Mr. Miney, they said, we're asking you, can you do it? I said, well, yes, I can. So I did it. And then I got more work from the thing, and Dan was a bit upset about this. Matter of fact, I was hailed up to his house. He had to hold up, yes.
Yeah.
And he said, now look here, Mr. Kermode. He said, I was thinking that it's rather strange, he said, that you're getting all this work, he said, and I'm not getting anything at all. I would be saying, if it was me, I'd be saying, now why is... I thought, oh, well, nothing to do with me, I'm getting the job, you see. And thereafter, and then sadly, of course, he died. But how I knew the routine of Toastmasters, formal things, because of my background in Freemasonry, you see.
All right.
And been to all these various functions, so I knew what you needed to do, and I made it up from there, and
Yeah.
more or less, and I'd seen, and other people had been over from across, and I'd seen them do it, and I'd had people saying, "You're as good as they are and better," and so.
Oh, right, yeah.
So that.
But still wearing the corporation's gear, were you?
I was for a while, yes, and then eventually I bought my own red coat, you see,
Yes.
and there was a fella over. You remember Alec O'Brien?
Yes.
Now Alex was out at the
At the Alex Inn.
Alex Inn,
Yeah.
and he knew me working at the Palace because he was a bars manager there as well. He was mixed up with the two, or he got the manager of the restaurant. He was a bit of a smart worker,
Yeah.
Alex, and he knew me, and he rang me one time. He said, "Laurence," he said, "I've got a guy coming over." He said, "It was a tailor." He said, "You interested?" I said, "Oh, aye." He said, "He'd make you a red coat."
Right.
So, what was his name now, this fellow? But anyway, he was from Manchester.
Mm.
He measured me up at the Palace there, and went over there. He measured me up for this red coat, and came back in a fortnight's time with the, fit try-on. He was making for a few local businessmen.
Oh, yes.
Because there weren't any tailors about.
No.
They died out, you
Yes.
see. I'd tried to get, and nobody seemed to know. Burton's didn't know what a red coat was for, or,
Yeah.
So they were the only thing I would hope. So he came over and he made me this wonderful red coat. And that year, I didn't know at the time, but that year he was the top tailor of Britain. And I have photographed him with all the various trophies
Really?
he won that year.
It must have cost you a fair old packet to buy it.
Well, it was a lot of money then. It
Yeah.
was over 50 quid, you see, for a
Yes.
coat. I mean, that was just for the red
a lot
coat.
of money then, yeah.
Of course, it was a lot of money. And then I had to the white tie and
All the rest of it,
all
yeah.
the rest of it, black trousers and stiff white shirt and cufflink, the whole
Yeah.
caboose, and. It was from there. I went on from there, you see.
As Toastmaster.
As Toastmaster.
Then you saw one or two royals, didn't
Oh,
you?
yes. Well, you see, I was working first mostly for the corporation, all these conferences. So any of the top people that came over, and I worked with all the top trade union leaders that have been over here,
Politicians.
and all that carry on. And then I was doing work for the government as well. Whenever you see, I was the only professional Toastmaster.
Yes.
I mean, you were a compere and lots of people, but they weren't interested in this sort of thing as I was. The formality, you see.
Yeah.
Not only that, when I mentioned before about it, I also bought a book, you see, on Toastmastering, written by an old professional Toastmaster. So I read up all on that, you see, all the protocol. So it wasn't just my background in masonry, it was other things as well, you see. And so I knew what you should have done. And then anybody that came over and they were involved with the government or the corporation, and they had big functions, I was there.
Yeah.
For many, many years, I always did the Tinwood banquet, which was held on the evening of July the 5th, mostly down at the Golf Links Hotel.
Yeah.
But at one time we did it up in the College of Further Education.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
I'll always remember that because the Minister of State, it was the Labour Minister of State he was, and I've mentioned this before about Toastmasters, about people, no matter who they are, they're all nervous when they get up to speak. And if you're standing behind them, you can watch their body language, and they'll say to you, this guy, this head of state, and he turned around to me after he'd said his piece, and he turned around and he said, was they all right?
They would give away their nerves in one way or another, these guests then.
Yes. But my first introduction to the royal family, if you wanted to know about the royal family, was way back in 1965 when Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon, she was married to Lord Snowdon then in those days, and she came over to open some, I don't know what it was, a pier or something, something anyway, and the do in the evening was at the Grand Island Hotel.
Oh, yeah.
Now I was down there, And what I noticed about Snowdon, he was immaculately dressed. He was very, very smartly dressed, and she was lovely. What surprised me first was how small she was. Of course, I realise now, since that the Queen and all, they're all small, short stature, like old Victoria, Queen Victoria, you see.
Yeah.
But his suit was, the back seam down here was sort of stitched together, so it was a permanent seam. They used to do the creases in your trousers like that. Some men used to do that. But afterwards, at one point in time, she was surrounded by a group of people afterwards, some of the top table, you know. I know it was before or after she went. She's a great smoker, you see.
Oh, yes.
And I was stood off, as you might say, because you don't mix in with these people.
No.
You are part of it, but you're not with them. You're not one of them.
Yes.
And, of course, you don't approach royalty ever.
No.
You never speak to them until they speak to you. She was surrounded by these people talking to her, and she had a cigarette, and she was puffing a cigarette, and there was no ashtray there. She was in the middle of the room, no ashtray available, and she was looking round. So I realised what she wanted was an ashtray, so I went up to her, gave her the ashtray. She dumped her fag in the ashtray and said thank you. So I rescued, and I came across it the other day, and I wondered what it was. I thought it was Paul who'd been sneaking a quiet fag when he was younger. But anyway, I realised what it was. I rescued this stump out of the ashtray, put it in my pocket and took it home. So when I got home, we were in the boarding house then, and my wife and the other people, the staff, you know, oh, well, what was she like and all this kind of, and what did she say to you? So I told them this story, and I said, and that's the sum total of the conversation I had with Princess Margaret. She just said thank you. And that was it. But since then, of course, I've been, if you go down the line, of course, there would be the Duke of Edinburgh was over in 1969. I was with him at the Palace. I'm talking about the Palace Hotel, of course, it was.
Yes.
1978, Princess Anne was over. And in 79, there were a lot of royalty over. That was the millennium year. The Gloucesters were over. The President of Malta, the President of Iceland, Her Majesty the Queen, of course, and King of Norway, Michael of Kent, the Queen Mother, lovely lady, the Queen Mother. I met twice, been with her. Princess Anne on more than one occasion. And the last of the royals that I dealt with was Prince Edward. Now the story there, it wasn't I don't think it was a Tynwald night, I don't think it was, it may have been, whatever it was, there was this do at the Golf Links Hotel. Now on that day, the very same day, he was only 21, Prince Edward, when he came over. And that very day I had heard on the radio that he had he got his degree, I don't know what it was, BA, Bachelor of Arts. So I thought to myself, now, should I include this in the preamble, you know, Prince Edward, Bachelor of Arts, you see? So I thought that would be this. No, erring on the conservative side. Don't be a fool, Laurence, I said to myself. You're dealing with royalty here, don't make a mess of it. So I didn't. I just did the usual preamble, His Royal Highness, blah, 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 His Royal Highness, the Prince Edward. So when he got up to speak, and he said to it, amongst his bits and pieces, blah, 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 and then he said, Mr. Toastmaster, he said, missed a wonderful opportunity, he said. He could have been the very first person to announce me with my new honours, he said, a Bachelor of Arts. So, you see, of course, a bit of a laugh. Now, it was a good thing that I didn't in two ways. It gave him the opportunity of telling people that he was passed, he got his Bachelor of Arts degree, and it was right for me because I've got the story to tell afterwards. And also you never upstage the principal artist, the top dog, and he was a top man.
Of course.
Now then the story goes on. The next night, of course, he was somewhere else, they were using him again at the palace thing, and I'm lined up there, It's now the casino, you see, and he's going into this special VIP's room, blah blah blah, and I'm lined up with other people waiting for him to come in, and he comes in with all his entourage, and he looks over at me and he says, he just laughed and he said, "You again?" Oh, yes. So that was, I liked Prince Edward. I liked him very much.
Tell me this, did you introduce him as Bachelor of Arts the second?
No. I didn't. I never know. No. I thought, well, that's it. I did it my way, as you might say. Oh, God. So it was very good, that. So.
Did you ever get yourself into a position like the famous Toastmaster of Michael Benteen, who finished up rolling around on the floor completely drunk, trying to introduce the ambassador?
I'm very happy to say no. It never happened to me, that. No.
You'd have to be careful, wouldn't you?
But you had to be very careful, and the great thing is this, and many people have said before me, the higher the ranking person they are in the in royalty or in the aristocracy or whatever, the higher they are, the more understanding they are, and the kinder and civil they are.
Yeah.
It's when you get upstarts, jumped upstarts, that think they're more than they are, So, but you always know your place, and you always, well, you treat them with respect, and they respect you, you see, and they always. These people, as I think I mentioned it before, and if I didn't mention it, I said they always look, when you're talking about their little peculiarities, they know, you see, a Toastmaster can make or break them, because you're in charge of the banquet, and if you can do something, you could, if you were so minded, but there's no Toastmaster fool enough to do it, to upset the whole business of while they're talking, or you could give them the wrong introduction, because although you introduce them, it's more formal than a compere of a concert.
Oh, yes.
It's much more formal, you see, although a lot of the formality is going out of it nowadays. People don't want.
So is the Toastmasters' day numbered then, do you think?
Well, it's surprising. In England, it's still there. But if I had been living in England, I could have had a very good living
as a Toastmaster.
As a Toastmaster, yes, because there's plenty of work there. Because it's all mostly down the south of England. But
well, there's one thing I must ask you about, and whether you're an old hippie, because here you've got a ring in one ear anyway, not two, but one certainly.
Well, yes, I have got. There was quite a bit of a story about that. I always fancied earrings because my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, my mother's father, he always wore what they called sleepers. Both ears he wore them in, the baker. Little earrings, one in each earring. I used to admire these earrings, but I wouldn't dare wear them. My wife said, "You do that," she said, "and I'll buy you a handbag." She used to say this to me, But I always fancied no, I didn't fancy the handbag. I fancied the earring.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't wear them. However, eventually, my younger son Nigel had a shop in Peel, and it was a boutique. And amongst the things, he was selling jeans and all that sort of thing. He was selling jewellery as well, and he was doing earrings, piercing people's ears, a quick gun thing. Well, we were down over the Christmas holidays one time, my wife and myself. He was showing us the shop, and he said, this is how you do it, Dad. He showed me the things, a little gun they use. And when my mother was a girl, they used to stick a cork behind it and put a red hot.
Really?
Yes, hot needle through your ear. There's no feeling in your ear. It doesn't bleed at the lobe. But anyway, so he said, "This is it." He said, "I've got an odd one here. Was a little stud, gold stud. I don't know where it is, gone somewhere." So my wife didn't say it because it was Nigel, so she wouldn't say it about their son.
No.
And he did the treatment, spirits and all that, bingo. and I had the stud in my ear.
Yes.
And I wore it, but she never said a word about that. And people did say, some people, but they knew me, and they knew that I was a bit of an extrovert, so they wouldn't mind. But the present earring is my wife's wedding ring.
Oh. Right.
So when she died,
Yeah.
I had it made into a
Oh,
ring.
that's nice.
Yeah.
Isn't that nice?
So that's the story of the ring, of the present earring. But there's a little story about it before this was in, because it was my wife was alive at the time. She used to love to go up Douglas Head. We used to go up there and sit sometimes. And in those days, it's not long ago, they disappeared, and I don't know where they went, but they used to have four-sided shelters.
Yes.
Up the Douglas Head.
Yeah.
We sit in there, and I was painting at the time. My wife was in one side round the corner, I was on the other side looking out over the bay, and I was painting with a palette knife, and there were some children, and they're always interested, you see, in artists. Well, the trick is you don't say anything to them. I never speak to kids, children, not at first, see. So they're running around, and then they look and they spot you, you see, and then they go around, and gradually they come nearer, you see, and nearer. And there were these two little children. One was a little boy and one was a little girl, you see. And one would be about 8 or 9 or 10, round between that age group, you see. And eventually the little boy comes and sits alongside of me, saying, I never spoke to him, but I kept on painting.
Yes.
And he's talking to me, and you know what the children are like. And he said, I was painting with the palette knife, and he said, well, he said, if I was going to paint, he said, if I was taking up paint, he said, I don't think I'd do it like that. He meant, thank you very much for that, you see. So the mother came, she was just in the distance, and she said, they're not bothering you, are they? Oh no, I said, it's all right, they're chatting. Then the little girl came, you see. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, he says to me, why are you wearing that earring? Just, I said, well, it knocked me off my perch a bit, you see. So he had one of these floppy hats on. So I said, well, I don't know. I said, why are you wearing that hat? And his sister, little girl, you know, so not what little girls are, you know, so knowledgeable and so worldly. She may be a year younger than him. Yeah. And she said, artists always wear earrings. Well, I laughed to myself, you know. It was so good. Eventually, those people, there were a couple, they used to come over. Every year they said they were waiting for the 4 o'clock boat to go because they wanted to spend as much time as possible. They used to come over, have rented a cottage in the country and then come and lose all track of time. They said they took their watches off, they ate when they wanted, they got up when they, you know, time there by their body clock, and these two young children. And anyway, I sent them, they gave me their address, so eventually I sent them this painting, got it framed and sent them. They were very pleased about that.
Well, you've got a lot of art in the house, of course, and some of your own work here, and you've been, among other things, I think, chairman of the Isle of Man Art Society.
Oh, yes. Well, I was in the Art Society years and years ago. I started, and I used to go to... I've always been interested in painting and pictures and art and that sort of thing.
You still do a bit today?
I know since I've had my knee operation, I haven't... I'm an outside painter. I'm not one of these people that can take a photograph. I've tried it and it doesn't come off. And go into and sit at home or in the school and paint. But I used to go to John Nick's class in the old School of Art, and you know, he was taking us teacher how to paint watercolours and that, and I used to go to a life drawing with Norman Sale and that sort of thing.
So you're happy with oils and watercolours?
Well, I used to paint in watercolours, and I never... Well, watercolours are lovely, really. Good watercolours are very nice and beautiful. That painting on the wall there is done by Catherine James. This is a beautiful picture of Poulvèche, and but no, I transferred to oils because it's a damn sight easier, because once you make a statement with watercolour, that's it. Well, the modern day watercolours anyway. The 18th century English watercolours, they used to paint over, but not the modern style. But with oils you can do something. You can paint light over dark, which you can't do with watercolours.
you.